Hi, and welcome to our fourth and final webinar for this year. My name is Catherine Hodak. I am the Sales and Marketing Coordinator for Team Logic IT, North Bay of San Francisco. We're thrilled to have you all here today, and we're thrilled to have Sinclair here to tell us about cybersecurity. But I'm going to hand the floor first across to Todd. With that said, I'm going to just invite you all to stay to the end where I will draw a raffle for a $200 gift certificate to the Tilted Platter, which is a local business that can bring you amazing platter of food. So I will do the drawing at the end. But without further ado, Todd.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I have been talking to clients probably for the last year in the area of cybersecurity as kind of the number one priority. We went through the effort of getting qualified with SeedPod Cyber so that we could offer everyone discounted cyber liability insurance. But often we don't go into a lot of details of what's important to look out for in an insurance policy? What are the standards that are constantly changing in the insurance industry and why and how we need to keep up with those standards? Whether we buy insurance or not, it's very important to play the absolute best defense you can play. So it's my pleasure to introduce Sinclair so that we can go through some of those items today and go a little deeper into what it is. So thanks everybody for joining and look forward to the presentation and any questions you might have.
Great. And with that said, I'm going to help Sinclair out by doing the PowerPoint. So Sinclair asked if you can hold your questions until the end. She's going to give you plenty of time for questions and answers. But if you have a burning topic you want or question that's really relevant to what she's talking about, please feel free to either raise your hand, put it in the chat, or the questions and answers, and we will be sure and get to them. So without further ado, I'm going to mute myself. But Sinclair, let me know as you would like me to.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Catherine. And if you want to pull up that PowerPoint presentation now, that would be great. Appreciate that. Todd, thanks for the introduction. As Todd mentioned, my name is Sinclair. I'm with SeedPod Cyber. So I work very closely with Todd and his team to help their clients really understand cyber insurance and take advantage of some of the benefits that we can offer because we've gone through a pretty extensive vetting process with Todd and the team over at Team Logic on their own security. So today, I know cyber insurance isn't the most exciting topic for most, but it's definitely become a top of mind topic for anyone evaluating their risk management strategy. Very important when you're thinking about resilience against evolving cyber threats. So today, I really just kind of wanted to give a good topical overview of cyber insurance, really understanding the gaps and the challenges we're seeing in the market, the risks, and really the realities of having cyber insurance coverage in 2025 for small to medium-sized businesses, right, as we keep it relevant to you guys. So without further ado, we can go ahead and dive right in, Catherine, if you want to go to the first slide. I'm going to preface this conversation with kind of giving a quick overview of the evolution of cyber insurance because it is still a much newer line of coverage, right? In the early 2000s, we saw cyber insurance kind of come into the market. It was mostly only being purchased by really large enterprises and highly regulated industries, so like the healthcare, finance sector. But as the years went on, we, definitely saw some high-profile breaches in the news, and it really raised awareness to how important it is. So we saw more and more companies getting on board, but small to medium-sized businesses still were, the adoption was very limited there. And then COVID hit, right? And I don't think anyone was truly prepared for that amount of remote workforce that was taking place. It left a lot of businesses exposed. And with that, the point of entry up until this point to get a cyber insurance policy was fairly easy. There wasn't a whole lot of vetting going on. And then when COVID hit, we started seeing a surge in ransomware and phishing incidents. and cyber insurance carriers were paying out claims left and right. And so I think that kind of took, well, it hardened the market, right? So in 2020, 2022, if you were shopping for cyber insurance, you probably noticed premiums were very expensive, almost unattainable for SMBs. And that's because carriers were trying to recoup that loss of all of these claims that they had to pay out during the COVID era. And so with that, they started adding in stricter security requirements. So carriers are looking for certain baseline controls to be in place, because they know it's going to help mitigate some of their own exposure in having to pay out claims. And over now, I'd say probably since 2023, we have seen the market stabilize quite a bit. Cyber insurance has become a lot more affordable. So if you do currently have it, now is a really good time to be shopping around to see if you could get better rates, um, because loss ratios have improved. So premiums have leveled off. But what we're seeing with that stabilization is really that carriers have upped the ante in what they're looking for from a security standpoint. They're no longer just issuing policies. They're doing, their diligence to make sure that you have invested to protect your organization. And then the cyber insurance comes in as an additional safeguard. So I always kind of like to start there. It definitely, cyber insurance started as a niche coverage for large enterprises. And what we're seeing, it has evolved into not only like a new standard for doing business, but also a line of coverage that doesn't just require you to pay your premium every year. It really does also require you to maintain a very strong focus on cybersecurity year round. So, Catherine, if you wouldn't mind popping over to the next slide. Awesome. So, quick note on what's going on in the cyber market. As I mentioned, carriers are raising the bar as it pertains to, what they're looking for in security requirements. Small to medium-sized businesses, we have seen certainly a shift in mindset with C-suite leaders in the SMB space. Actually, ConnectWise just released their 2025 SMB report, and it showed that now 51% of C-suite leaders are putting emphasis on their approach to cybersecurity as like one of their top 3 initiatives going into 2026, which is great because that means it's getting the attention that it should have. Cyber threats aren't going anywhere, and there's a lot of misconceptions by SMBs and in the SMB space that like they don't really need cyber insurance and they're not targets. So it's really an interesting shift to see and a really good one to see. We're going to talk a lot about evolving threats. So what we're seeing in the market as what to keep an eye out for. Of course, we've all heard of AI, and that has changed the threat landscape in a lot of ways. And then finally, as we've seen cyber insurance evolve, and as I mentioned, these security requirements that have come with getting this line of coverage in place, it has almost become a new standard of doing business. I don't know if anyone else here has seen this in contractual obligations. We certainly are seeing it more and more on our side, where people are just requiring you to have cyber insurance just to do business, because they know that it's an important layer of safety for them if they're working with you, as well as for your own business. So there are definitely some compliance and business pressures taking a role here in cyber insurance. So no longer just a safety net, it is kind of becoming a business requirement. And I would say across we've seen that in highly regulated industries where you're handling, sensitive patient data or finance information, sensitive corporate information. So like regulated industries, but now we are really starting to see it across all industries. And so might be required to meet compliance and definitely to survive incidents and make it to the other side. So if you want to hop on over, thank you, Catherine. So I hope that this is big enough for everyone to see. This is from a 2024 net diligence report, which was released in 2025 because, it takes some time to get the data for the previous year. But this just shows the top 5 sectors in terms of actual number of claims reported. So we're looking at professional services, manufacturing, healthcare, of course, financial services, and also retail. You'll see the average incident cost there was $205,000. And then we also have just a quick chart showing the top five number of claims for like the actual incident type. So ransomware, no surprise, that's really for a while now been one of not only the most frequent types of incidents reported, but also the most severe, as you can see, significantly more dollars lost here for ransomware threats. Business email compromise is here as well. That is one we're certainly seeing increase just as of the last, I'd say, year or two. We're seeing more and more business email compromise incidents, which then typically lend to things like invoice manipulation, because now a threat actor has access to your emails, right? So they can intercept legitimate invoices, make requests on your company's behalf. They can impersonate you or your organization, I should say. And also funds transfer fraud. So they're able to access your bank credentials once they get access to your email. So that's a really up and coming one because of the rise of AI. It used to be very easy to look at an email and pretty much, see that it was a threat actor trying to phish you. And it's just with the rise of AI becomes so much easier for them to take advantage of human error. Then we've got hacking, so just good old data breaches where your data is stolen and it's sold on the dark web. Wire transfer fraud, like I mentioned, that one's definitely higher up in dollars lost. And then staff mistakes, right? So human errors, that definitely plays a role in incidents that we see reported. And on this slide, again, just like to provide some color. This is for SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises between 2019 and 2023. All of the claims reported by sector and kind of what the minimum payout was for those incidents, the average, and then the maximum, as well as the number of claims reported. Just to kind of add some color, if you can spot your industry in here, give you an idea of kind of what you're up against. Awesome. All right. And we'll go more into detail on actual cyber exposure here shortly as well. Catherine, if you want to bop on over to the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so emerging threats, finance and wire transfer fraud, like I just mentioned, email compromise and vendor impersonation is really driving fraudulent payments, as well as invoice manipulation becoming increasingly common. Kind of the same scenario I just explained, where a threat actor has access to your emails. If you think about all of the email exchanges that take place in your organization every day, there's definitely some information that could be exposed through that, and emails that can be intercepted, like legitimate invoices. And I do think that has definitely been driven by artificial intelligence just getting better at impersonating human behavior. Then you've also got ransomware. We've talked about that. So it's still very new how AI has impacted that. I will say endpoint detection and response solutions have come a very long way and have proven to be very powerful in mitigating the risk of a ransomware incident. Microsoft actually stated like 90%. It mitigates the risk of a ransomware event by 90% to have just an EDR solution in place. However, AI-driven malware has now also gotten really good at quickly replicating and moving across networks. So it'll be very interesting to see how technology evolves alongside AI-driven malware and other types of attacks, to see, hopefully technology keeps up. I'm sure it will. Then we've got cloud and vendor risk. This is also becoming an increasingly important item to consider, because we work in a very we rely on so many third parties for so many different things in the digital world that we work in, and we operate in. So third party platforms are actually becoming a very frequent breach entry point. And so we will get into that as well. Vetting vendors, what are you looking for? What are you giving them access to? And just making sure you've got your protections in place against if someone you're working with and who is connected to your network suffers an incident, and how that will impact your ability to operate. And then social engineering. So we're all probably familiar with the term social engineering. We've seen phishing attempts via email. Now we're even hearing of vishing and deep fakes. Really the number one attack vector right now, again, because of AI. And something I hear all the time. I work with small to medium-sized businesses quite often. We'll ask if they have cyber insurance, and I think there's a misconception between what their general liability and their business owner policies cover, even if you've got like a writer. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, your commercial lines of coverage in, I would say, 98% of cases is going to explicitly exclude anything related to a cyber loss. So anything related to a cyber incident, it is not going to cover. Typically, there is language in commercial policies excluding them specifically. Then there are also riders. So there's like an endorsement that you can add for some amount of cyber coverage. And those typically only cover third party. So this would be, the liability for any damages caused to others because of an incident that occurs. And usually in not very adequate amounts from what I've seen, usually, $50,000 to $100,000, which, as we just saw, the average loss of an incident is going to surpass that. So just something to keep in mind. Certainly do look at your general liability policy and confirm, but that is typically the case. So this cyber insurance is designed to cover the things those policies were not built to cover, because it's a very unique risk. Thank you. Okay, and so why does it matter? Like I said, I work with small and medium-sized businesses all the time. And I can understand where they're coming from. It's another line of coverage. How much are you going to pay in insurance every year, every month? So I totally understand the sentiment there. But it is very important. And like I said earlier, I have noticed a shift in that mindset. SMBs are starting to prioritize security and, remaining resilient in the face of a cyber attack. But these are just some of the objections I hear often when working in the SMB space. We're too small to be targeted. As you can see here at the bottom of this slide, this is like one of the most dangerous assumptions, because 98% of all of those claims that we were just looking at, right, from 2019 to 2023, were all reported by small to medium-sized businesses, 98% of them. And the reason for that is threat actors want an easy target. They want to get in and they want to get out and they want to get as much as they can from the ordeal. And so oftentimes small to medium-sized businesses are seen as easier targets. So they're actually actively being targeted more so than larger enterprises. We pay an IT provider to protect our systems. Yep, I get that too. And security is definitely an investment and an important one. Cyber insurance does not replace security. And security, like if you turn, we've all heard of, AT&T, Verizon. I always like to call out MGM because that was a crazy incident. I don't know if anyone here heard about that a few years ago. But these are like, multi-million-dollar enterprises who surely have the top security in place, cybersecurity budgets that are massive. And they still suffer incidents. So there's always going to be a vulnerability. No system is impenetrable. And the cyber insurance is what protects your balance sheet when security isn't enough and something does happen. So it is for catastrophic losses, but your IT provider does a great job. We know they do. We vetted them and they're carrier approved. So this is just a safeguard for if something does happen. We don't have the budget. Again, I understand that, certainly. I think there is a misconception on how expensive cyber insurance really is, because if you especially now, right? Since 2023, the market has stabilized. I think it's a lot more affordable than most people assume it's going to be. Typically, like at least through our program, I know most clients would be eligible for $1 million in coverage for like $2,000 a year. Of course, I can't speak for everyone. I can't guarantee that. Every situation's different. But if you look at the potential loss versus the annual cost, it's really not that expensive. And if you think about if you did have an incident and had to write a check for $200,000, I'm sure if 2,000 isn't in the budget, 200,000 certainly isn't going to be. So our data isn't sensitive enough. I hear that as well. I've worked with a few clients who are like, well, but the data that we work with is in the public domain. Like someone could try to extort us for it, but it's literally available to anybody. And there's so much more that goes into an incident than just data being stolen and damages resulting from that data being taken. Reputational harm, downtime when you're unable to operate, causing loss of revenue. Notifying impacted parties. There's a lot more that goes into responding to and recovering from an incident that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the data that you're maintaining. And then we've never had an incident before. Of course, as we talked about, cyber threats are evolving, and all because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't. Honestly, in this day and age, it's not a matter of if, it really is a matter of when. And I hate to say that because it sounds like a scare tactic, but it just is. It just is. It's the truth. And another stat here at the bottom, 60% of SMBs that suffer a major cyber incident typically go out of business within 6 months. So again, we hear a lot more about the large businesses who suffer incidents, on the news. We don't hear about the small guys, but it is happening. And unfortunately, the small to medium-sized businesses are going to feel the financial fallout a lot more so than those larger enterprises would when something does happen. So just something to keep in mind. Yeah, Catherine, thank you. Okay, so prevention starts here. Obviously, cyber insurance is important. The security you invest in is very important. But there are some other things that don't cost you really much of anything to do that can help mitigate your risk. So internal payment policies, as we saw, wire transfer fraud, funds transfer fraud, social engineering, these are all on the rise. So making sure that you have internal policies to prevent those from happening based on human error is very important. So, what kind of policy do you have in place for your employees if they get an email requesting changes to a customer's account information or a vendor's account information? It seems very obvious, but you want to make sure that they know not to, well, you want to authenticate the request, right? But you're not going to do that by giving any kind of, you're not going to respond to the inquiry or the request directly. And you certainly don't want to call a number that's been provided in the request to authenticate it. You want to call a number that you previously have had on your, in your system for that vendor or client to validate that it is in fact them requesting that. Same things goes for funds transfer. So, you want to make sure there's separation of duties in authenticating a wire transfer request, or I'm sorry, sending a wire transfer request. But even authenticating it, making sure you're calling a pre-existing documented phone number. And, I would go as far as having that separation of duty and having two people internally having to sign off on that before funds are transferred. And then, I've had to throw in something about buying gift cards because we've probably all at least seen that once. Your executive is probably not asking you to buy gift cards, but certainly, you want to authenticate that request. Some other internal controls, working with your bank to implement dual authorization on all wire transfers and bank change requests. Certainly will mitigate the risk of a wire transfer going through that shouldn't have. Implementing dual authorization for issuance of all vendor payments as well. And like I mentioned, that separation of duties to make sure that not just one internal team member is responsible for authenticating and sending wire transfers. So those are some internal payment policies that I would definitely look at having. And we did actually put together some example policies that we'll be sending after today's webinar that you can kind of use to develop some internal policies around these items. And yeah, Catherine. Okay, thank you. So employee and vendor policies, like I mentioned earlier, third parties being responsible for being like the point of entry in a breach is becoming increasingly common. And we all work with so many different third parties. Making sure you're vetting them is very important. We have put together a checklist that we will also be sending after today's webinar to kind of give you an idea of what you should be looking at based on what type of vendor they are. But access control, we want to only provide access to systems and data that is absolutely necessary for them to do their duties. Also requiring vendors to carry their own cyber insurance coverage. We're seeing it increasingly on our side because it just helps mitigate loss. And if something did happen, you want to make sure all parties involved have that extra layer of protection. Acceptable use policy. So define how both employees and vendors as well can actually use company systems, networks, and connected devices. Hardware and data disposal policies. So this is actually something that a lot of insurance applications will ask you if you have. A lot of businesses, I feel like, don't, especially if they're not working with an MSP. But establishing a secure process for actually wiping and destroying, recycling devices and sensitive data is very important. Background checks. So that one seems pretty obvious, but screening any employees or contractors that are going to be handling sensitive systems or have access to any of your critical data, definitely want to make sure you're doing background checks. And then onboarding and offboarding procedures. So you want to make sure that, fairly quickly you've got a process in place so that if an employee is discharged from their position, that you have removed all of their access to the systems. So that helps obviously prevent unauthorized entry. All right, and then third and final, maintaining the baseline security controls. I know this looks like a lot. I won't spend too much time talking about these unless, Todd, you want to hop in or Catherine wants to hop in and speak to any of these. But these are what we look for at SeedPod, as well as what most carriers are asking for at this point in across the industry. I kind of separated them into 3 tiers. Tier 1 is super high impact, really low barrier to entry controls. So multi-factor, dual authentication, whatever you want to call it. I know a lot of people hate this one, but it really is like the first line of defense for preventing unauthorized access to your anything, right? Any of your apps, your network as a whole. So, and also critical for any kind of remote and admin access. You want to have MFA deployed. Security awareness training with phishing simulations. Again, very easy to get a formal automated program in place. And it really does help reduce the risk of that human error, which is, as we've talked about, your number one attack vector. Email filtering, that's pretty obvious, right? You want to block malicious messages before they even get into the employee's inbox. Strong password policies that follow some sort of framework, like a NIST framework, for example. So like you have to have X amount of characters and symbols, all of that good stuff. And then also account cleanup. So kind of like what we talked about with those internal policies, making sure dormant accounts don't have certain access and that they're removed in a timely manner. SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, these are really controls. I'm not a security person, but they do help prevent email spoofing and domain impersonation, which with business email compromise as a rising threat is increasingly important. Some tier 2 moderate, but also core controls would be your patch management so that you can close any known vulnerabilities before an attacker exploits them. having backups because, like we've all talked about, ransomware is a very real threat, and you want to make sure you can operate from your backups. Um, an endpoint detection and response solution. I know I had mentioned it earlier, very important for mitigating that ransomware exposure by like 90%. So carriers are pretty much requiring that one out the gate. Secure remote access. If you are accessing your network remotely, you want to make sure you're doing that with a VPN. And then tier 3, which slightly higher effort, but certainly advanced hardening, would be making sure data is encrypted as it moves through your network, blocking certain ports from external access, and then role-based and least privileged access. So you want to make sure that certain employees only have access to the things they need to do their job. So what happened? That looks a little weird. But that's fine. So there are certainly some challenges in the cyber insurance market. Yeah, we can hit it. I talk about challenges in the cyber insurance market all day. So high claim denial rate, and this is really a really big problem because we've got employees who aren't really necessarily in tune with the technical environment completing applications for the carriers on cyber insurance. And so that's led to incorrect responses, which is the leading cause for a claim being denied. So 44% claim denial rate as it pertains to cyber insurance, either a flat out denial or limited payout. So definitely want to make sure you're involving your MSP in completing those applications. They are getting increasingly technical. We've also got stricter underwriting requirements, which we just talked about. Carriers are expecting more from businesses if they want to get this line of coverage. All of those security controls probably sound really scary. They do to me. I'm not a security person, but I do know working with MSPs quite often, those are some baseline requirements, right? So there's nothing too crazy there. I think carriers are expecting, the basics for you to protect your system. Narrowing coverage. So I know you can't see this on the slide, but we are seeing a lot of sublimits and exclusions for certain types of incidents. So like a ransomware incident, that's one of the most severe kinds of incidents that can happen. When you're evaluating your coverage, you want to make sure you have your full primary limit of coverage for ransomware. I see that sublimited way more often than I'd like to. And it's a problem. Cloud outages is another one that we've seen. CrowdStrike was something like that. But if a cloud service provider goes down, a carrier is left with a massive amount of claims all at once. And so what carriers have started doing is they're narrowing their coverage. They're adding fine print that, either limits the coverage being offered, or in some cases, like with cloud outages or operating systems, if there was a large outage, I've seen language for systematic sublimits. So if you suffer an incident having to do with that exact situation or operating system, I should say, they'll slash your coverage by 50%. So you just want to make sure you're reading through, what limits of coverage are in what areas. And if it's a high exposure area, you want to make sure you have, an adequate amount of coverage there. And then underinsurance. So again, like I talked about, those riders on commercial policies often are just so inadequate. And it's unfortunate because a lot of times when I'm speaking with small to medium-sized business owners, they really are operating under an assumption that they have cyber insurance. But if you don't really understand your cyber risk and what your exposure is or could be, you won't be able to recognize what might be insufficient. And then third-party risk. Limited vetting of vendors does leave exposure. and unclear policy language creates disputes at claim time, which is why I mentioned wanting to have third parties, especially those who have access to your critical systems, to have their own cyber insurance policy. But yeah, making sure that you do have some sort of coverage. So, for example, AWS, I don't know if anyone experienced anything from the AWS outage. But luckily that only lasted 2 hours, right? That was over the weekend on Sunday. But that impacted a whole lot of systems. There were some companies who couldn't operate for those 2 hours because of the outage. It wasn't because of a breach. But there are actual cyber insurance coverage sections, or I should say coverage sections in a cyber insurance policy that would offer compensation for if a third party that you rely heavily on to operate goes down, and it causes downtime on your end, that you would be covered for any loss of revenue during that time. So that I think is definitely an important element that you'd want to make sure your policy has. And that covers the challenges, at least the big ones, right? So what gets a claim denied? We already talked about those inaccurate application responses. So definitely want to make sure you're involving the people who understand the tech on those applications, because they really are technical. Failure to meet security controls listed in the policy, that kind of ties into inaccurate application responses. But during each renewal, you do want to make sure to go back and double check. I think what happens is people get comfortable and they just assume nothing's changed, so they recheck all the boxes. And so, that's why working with an MSP makes a huge difference. Even if you filled out the application and at the time of doing so, what you attested to was accurate. When something happens and forensics comes out to evaluate the situation, they'll very quickly realize if you just stopped doing that, or that control wasn't being maintained the way that it was supposed to be. So making sure that you stay in compliance and double check each year when you get your renewal, you go through that process, that exercise. Delayed reporting of incidents is another one. So definitely want to read through your policy language and understand what their expectation is. How quickly do you need to report it? And how quickly do you need to be able to prepare documentation and audit trails of what happened to provide to them for your claim? And then nation state or terrorism exclusions as well. So if there was an incident and it was tied, goodness, I was just talking to someone, a manufacturer who had an incident, and their cyber insurance offered a partial payout because it was found that it was someone, I think it was a Chinese threat actor group who was trying to steal proprietary manufacturing information so that they could manufacture themselves. Something like that. But anything that could be tied to nation state or terrorism could be excluded. So you want to make sure you look at your TRIA form. And if you do want to opt into that coverage, you have to elect to do so. Otherwise, it typically is just excluded by default. All right, so what to look for when reviewing coverage options. We've kind of talked about these throughout today's presentation. Low sublimits, right? You want to understand first what your cyber exposure is and then evaluate each coverage section to make sure that it would offer adequate coverage if you needed it. And I always try to remember, right, insurance is for catastrophic events. So definitely keep that in mind. Systematic risk exclusions is something you want to keep an eye out for. Read the fine print. Unfavorable cost sharing. So especially as it pertains to cyber insurance, I know with like property insurance, co-insurance clauses are more common, but I have seen cyber insurance policies with them, and that essentially it creates unfavorable cost sharing, especially in addition to like high deductibles or something like that. So you want to make sure that you have to put out as little amount of money in the event of an incident as possible before your coverage kicks in and covers the rest. And then restrictive wording, so narrowing coverage, what we just talked about. You want to see what their definition of a computer system is. Does that include or exclude cloud systems, SaaS providers? And then also, what kind of consent is required before expenses will be paid? You want to make sure you understand that claims handling process, so that when you are suffering like the worst day of your life, you will know exactly what needs to happen. Okay, so we talked about a few of these, but an incident response plan and one that you've tested or at least run through some examples of, what would happen if we had a social engineering threat or a ransomware incident, and walk through what that would look like. Making sure you test restoration from your backups. How quickly could you be operational from those if you needed to? Understanding your cyber insurance reporting requirements and making sure you have the tools in place to be able to realistically provide those audits and those logs. Vetting your vendors, and then also developing and testing communication protocols. So that kind of falls into what your incident response plan would cover. But once an incident is discovered, who's your first call, and from there, what is the chain of communication? Yeah, so like we talked about, cyber insurance is definitely becoming a very important element of risk management and resiliency. Security tools reduce risk, certainly, but they don't always fully eliminate it. No system's impenetrable. Insurance will help you recover financially and operationally. And as we talked about, small to medium-sized businesses are not too small to be targeted. They're, in most cases, the primary target, and will experience the most financial impact from an incident. So homework, and this is something we can help you with. As Todd mentioned, we're partners, but certainly, dig up your current cyber insurance policy and give it a look over while it's top of mind. Identify what those sublimits may look like. Do you have any listed exclusions in your policy? Are there any co-insurance clauses? What's your deductible? And then also, insurance. What you attested to on your application is almost never included in your policy document. So you'd have to go through your records to find it. But, I would certainly want to double check what I attested to last year when I got my policy, to make sure that was filled out, accurately. And if you do want to understand your specific cyber risk, and you want to check your policy against your security environment to make sure everything's aligned, here at SeedPod, we do have a very easy tool that will essentially provide you a report that shows you all of those things in a very easy to understand way. So if you are interested in taking an insurability audit, it takes about 5 minutes, and we'd be happy to provide that to you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sinclair. How about questions? Let's take questions. Does anyone have any questions for Sinclair? You can put them in the Q&A, the chat, or raise your hand and I will. Oh my goodness. No questions? Sinclair did such a good job. Okay, Benjamin, here we go. What did Benjamin say? No questions. Thank you for the explanation. Great. You're welcome, Sinclair. Sorry, you're welcome, Benjamin. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? Yes, I believe so. Yes. So I will send that out to everybody who's on this call. Yes. Thanks, Thomas. Great question. Todd wants to raise his hand.
I just had to do that for the fun of it. I just wanted to emphasize too that because we're partners, most of the slide that she showed the different tiers of security and protection, that we're meeting that criteria for you. And we have been talking to you about that for some time. It's like one of those things that it keeps changing. So it may feel like a bit salesy, like we're trying to sell stuff to you, but really we're just trying to keep up with good defensive posture when it comes to cybersecurity. And the standards have changed. Like, I think even 2 years ago, that EDR on the list wasn't there. You just needed antivirus. But now, because of the cleverness of the criminals, they're able to move laterally in the network. We have to be able to detect that, and we can only do that with EDR. So now everyone has Huntress, that's our client, and that's a managed EDR, and that satisfies the requirement.
Thank you, Todd. Stephanie, for clarity, what is the process SeedPod has in place for regular audits or assessments to verify cybersecurity compliance? Sinclair, do you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned, we have an insurability audit tool that pretty much asks you a couple of questions about your business, just so we can kind of understand your risk. And then we actually work directly with Todd and his team over at Team Logic to confirm your security environment. If you have a current policy, we just ask you to send us that. And then we generate a report that provides a breakdown of your actual risk exposure based on the information Todd provided and your policy language. Are you compliant? And a gap analysis. So we'll look at your risk exposure and say, okay, are there any limits that are too low here? Is there any language that's concerning within the policy? And kind of just package it all up.
Great. Stephanie, does that feel like it answers the question for you? Got it. Thank you. Yes. Great. All right. Any other questions that we can answer? We'll be sending out as a follow-up the PowerPoint, the checklist that Sinclair mentioned, and the payment policies as well. So as a template for you all as a follow-up. Anything else you want to ask Sinclair? Going once, going twice? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording. And